Hello, my name's Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Today I'm going to be talking about our first president, George Washington, and the time he was a sitting duck for a British officer who ended up sparing his life at the Battle of Brandywine on September 11, 1777. Yes, that army officer was Major Patrick Ferguson. I'm going to talk a little bit about Patrick Ferguson because he's very significant. He's relevant. So Patrick Ferguson invented a the what's called the Ferguson rifle, and it was actually used at this battle. So it was one of the early uh, breech loading rifles, a breech loading rifle, which meant that you know, they didn't have to use the muzzle loading rifles, which needed a ramming rod. Um, for those of us who've watched, movies on, on warfare, in the during the Revolutionary Wars, uh, and earlier, we noticed that back then, rifles were, soldiers used rifles in which they had to pause and then ram the use a ramming rod to reload, their shots. So with the invention of this Ferguson rifle by this very major Patrick Ferguson, it meant that it was an innovation that allowed, the British soldiers to be able to reload their rifles in a prone position, so they didn't have to, and they can maintain cover, so they didn't have to be standing while they were reloading. So the British had this superiority in terms of advanced weaponry. Of course, this was shortly after the British Revolution, Industrial Revolution, right? The Industrial Revolution first started in England, and this was in 1750. So this was a major innovation, and this guy, Major Patrick Ferguson, of course, was a remarkable man. He also came, interestingly, he came from a Scottish noble family, a Scottish aristocratic family. He was the son of a Lord Pitfer, right? A Lord Pitfer. And this guy was Senator Justice, and his mother as well came from Scottish nobility. So he was very well connected, and he, of course, was also intelligent in that he was responsible for inventing the Ferguson Ordnance rifle, and this rifle was actually used at this particular battle, uh, the Battle of Brandywine on September 11, 1777. Now, interestingly, we know that George Washington came within a hair's breadth of his life, and he was a sitting duck because and he was literally sitting on his horse, mounted, and he was backing Major Ferguson because Major Ferguson put it in his diary. He had a journal entry after the battle in which he said, and I'm going to quote him if I can recall the precise words. So he said, you know, that he was looking at, George Washington was backing him, and he as he said, I could have lodged. I'm going to quote him directly because I actually remember the words in the journal entry. He goes, I could have lodged half a dozen balls, uh, in or about him, uh, before he was out of my reach. But it was not pleasant uh, to fire at the back of an unoffending individual who was acquitting himself very coolly of his duty. So I let him alone. And that's a journal entry of Major Ferguson. And it was George Washington that he was looking at. And let me just let me repeat the journal entry. Again, this is from memory. So he goes, I could have lodged half a dozen balls in or about him before he was out of my reach. But it was not pleasant to fire at the back of an unoffending individual who was acquitting himself very coolly of his duty. So I let him alone. So that's a journal entry of Major Patrick Ferguson after the Battle of Brandywine on September 11, 1777, and he was referring to uh, George Washington. Unfortunately for Major Ferguson, however, he was felled. He died at the at another battle 3 years later, on October 7, 1780. He died at the Battle of King Mountain in South Carolina. So he had been giving an assignment to recruit American loyalists into his militia. So some patriots, he got into, a battle with some patriots, and he was the only officer on either side of the forces, the contending forces on that day, and so he got killed, and they say his body was desecrated, unfortunately for him. Uh, so you know, uh, the reason I wanted to discuss this today is just to show us how history can play out. So here was George Washington. Um, he's been, there's a book I read about him, and he was described as the indispensable hero, or the indispensable man. In think that was the title of the book, George Washington, the Indispensable Man. And of course, he was our first commander in chief, our first president, and of course, he was instrumental in America's independence. And a lot that happened, and the architecture of our government subsequently, because he was the patron of Alexander Hamilton, who of course divided our American system. And so, without George Washington, if he had been killed at that battle by Major Ferguson, who had him within his sight, but he spared his life. As he said, he let him alone. He was, George Washington was just literally backing him and a sitting duck, but he decided not to shoot him. And so you see how fate turns out, it plays out. So I guess it was written, the stars. And Major Ferguson, on the other hand, he got killed, 3 years after. Um, and I did military history in school. This was about 30 years ago. Yeah. So the reason why I wanted to talk about this was because I also remembered I was searching my old professor. His name was Dr. Yearwood, Professor Yearwood, an Irishman who taught me military history, and I enjoyed the course. I guess I can say I'm almost a pacifist. I'm against violence, and I don't like wars. But interestingly, in that course, military history, I remember I was taught that there's sort of a correlation, a connection between um, technological advancement and warfare. And it turns out that warfare uh, has tended to propel technological advancement, right? I've mentioned in an earlier video about how uh, it was the U.S. military that developed the internet. It worked, starting with ARPANET, and this actually was developed during the Vietnam War. And similarly, if we look in history, we find that many, we often talk about Roman engineering and technological advances uh, without taking note that it was the Romans' affinity with warfare, their constant warring, that led to their technological advancement and engineering. The Romans were known uh, for their roads, their aqueducts, and whatnot. Their military advancement, and other great inventions. And similarly, other empires, in history, for instance, the Mongol Empire, the Qing dynasty, these are amongst the largest empires we've ever had in history. The Mongolian Empire, of course, that's affiliated with the Chinese, empire. The Mongolian Empire of Genghis Khan or Genghis Khan. Some people call him Temujin, Genghis Khan, the same person. So the largest contiguous empire ever. So they were constantly warring. And of course, you have the Qing dynasty of China. They're amongst the top five largest empire by landmass ever. Um, then remarkable for the creation of gunpowder. The creation of gunpowder was done accidentally, but they soon used gunpowder for, in their, military, in warfare. They were the first to uh, develop guns, right? Guns was first invented in China due to their numerous warfares at that time, the expansionism. And of course, they developed the cannon, right? And other explosives. Now, the largest empire by landmass in history was the British Empire, right? A very, a very tiny island. So they had an affinity for wars. I'd been talking earlier about their history, English history, and you notice how they were constantly fighting wars. It was a constant. I think I don't know if there was ever a year without the British, for a long time without them going to war with one power, principality or the other. So they're constantly at war. And the British, since they got access to gunpowder and guns, which were first invented by another, warfaring entity, that's the Chinese empires, the Mongolian, and of course the Qing dynasty, right? They subsequently, uh, the British also started to advance, make revolutionary innovations in uh, in firearms and in guns. Up until they were very innovative up until the 20th century. The famous uh, Wembley gun, the Webley gun. The British invented the tank during the First World War, and of course the innovative Ferguson rifle, which was it was the first time a breech loading rifle was used in military warfare. So, uh, you know, and even up until the time of uh, the ascendancy of the United States, we see that nuclear weapons were first used. The nuclear bomb was first used by the Americans, and this was developed during the Second World War through the Manhattan Project, right? And of course, uh, this goes on, and even we find that the advancement in U.S. technology, where America landed men on the moon, their space, uh, their space development and whatnot. This came with the fallout of the Second World War, because America actually had a secretive operation called Operation Overcast. It was later renamed Operation Paperclip, in which U.S. officials hired about 1,600 uh, German scientists, engineers, and technicians. And what they did was uh, they whitewashed or they erased their Nazi affiliations and any war crimes they may have committed, so that they could use the German scientists in advancing their you know chemical and biological research, and also the development of their rockets and uh, aviation systems. Notable amongst these scientists was a guy called Werner Werner von Braun, and this guy was instrumental in the development of U.S. spacecraft, and of course NASA, and you know and other rocket systems that America had, because he had been working on the V2 rockets that the Germans and Nazis were developing. So It's unfortunate, but again, I learned from military history about how warfare has tended to actually advance and propel technological development, and this was consistent during the Revolutionary War as well. So this Ferguson rifle, invented by Major Patrick Ferguson, uh, was actually invented. It was patented during the War of Independence in 1776. Although he may have invented in 1774, but it was patented in 1776. It was very costly to produce, so I think that Battle of Brandywine was the only time that the rifles were used. Uh, you in any event, again, it's consistent uh, with uh, with the premise that technology advances, uh, with warfaring nations. And the last example I'm going to give is the instance of Nigeria. Of course, I'm originally from Nigeria, and again, I did military history, and I also studied the Nigerian Civil War. So during the Nigerian Civil War between 1967 and 1970, of course, the Biafran forces were trying to secede. Biafra was trying to secede. That was in southeastern Nigeria, southeastern Nigeria, and of course, when they were blockaded by federal forces, the Nigerian federal forces, who were supported actually by the West, and the Biafran forces end up getting the support of the Soviet Union. So they were blockaded, unfortunately, and during the blockade, it meant they couldn't get arms, they couldn't get weapons. However, the Biafran forces developed, uh, through their research and production units, started developing weapons themselves. They developed guns, rifles, armored cars, and improvised explosives. So one of the guns that they were and explosives they were known for was actually called, was it the Obunigwe. So they developed a lot of arms, and this is widely known. So they developed guns. So Nigeria has the technology. In fact, the guns were developed during the Nigerian Civil War. They developed their own guns and armored cars, and pistols, explosives, even rockets. And this was invented by the Biafran forces who were fighting, the Nigerian federal forces. Nigerian federal forces ended up winning, and brought Biafra back into, the Biafra was trying to secede, and they brought them back into the Nigerian Union. So why why Nigerians have not been producing their own guns and their own cars? Many things. In fact, cars were developed then. Um, that's a question above my pay grade. It's a geopolitical question that's clearly above my pay grade. So yeah, I'm gonna keep this video short, and I think I covered what I wanted to discuss today about how George Washington's life was spared by a Scotsman, Major Ferguson, who actually invented the Ferguson Ordnance rifle, which was used by the British in the Revolutionary War of Independence. And again, so interestingly, that battle, the Battle of Brandywine, was September 11th, 1777, and Major Ferguson was killed 3 years later by Patriots at the Battle of Kings Mountain, in South Carolina on October 7th, 1780. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I like talking about American presidents. I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury, and fraud on the courts, which have led to a deprivation of my rights, my constitutional rights, my civil rights, and my human rights. In any event, today is also December the 25th, so I'm wishing you a Merry Christmas. Thank you.